Okay, we're ready to go.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for the second Hot Topics event of the semester, the 2020 election and the future of the world order, with Professor of Political Science Gary Winslett. I'm the director of the Rohatyn Student Advisory Board, and the Rohatyn Student Advisory Board is responsible for organizing these Hot Topics lectures along with other different activities and events that have that are globally oriented through the Rohatyn Center for Global Affairs. And Hot Topics lectures are intended to provide students with a platform to engage with a Middlebury professor with a familiar hot topic in the news. And in normal times, we host these events in the RCGA conference room with catered food during lunchtime. And although that's obviously not possible today, we're still super excited to have Professor Winslett here with us. So the format remains the same. It's 15 to 20 minutes for the professor's presentation and 30 minutes for discussion and Q&A. And please hold off on asking questions until the Q&A portion of the event. That'll be done through raising hands, and please feel welcome to keep your camera on just to make it more personable if that's something that you're comfortable with. And as mentioned earlier, Professor Winslett is a professor of political science. His current research focuses on the relationship between large tech companies and the US government. So please help me in welcoming Professor Winslett. And thank you again, Professor, for agreeing to host this super timely Hot Topics.
Thanks, happy to do it. So a couple of quick notes. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because we're going to do some slides. So yeah, a couple quick notes. One is that if you've sort of been into my classes, you've seen that I tend to try to present multiple viewpoints and try to sort of both sides a lot of things. And when I was talking to the organizers of this event, I asked them if they wanted to do that or if they just sort of wanted my analysis on it. And they actually told me that students would be really interested in like hearing a professor's like perspective, not just them sort of saying what all the different views are. So that's what I'm going to do. So it's a little less both sidesy than my classes usually are, but I think people will like sort of hearing at least what my sort of analytical take is on this. And the second thing is we'll be doing slides. We're going to go pretty quick because I think that'll just be more visually interesting than watching me talk with the wall behind me. So let's go ahead and start on this. Okay. Okay, so when I talk to students and sort of ask them about what they think about the 2020 election and I say the future of the world order, most of their reactions are something like this. Oh my God, no, the world feels like it's falling apart. And there's understandable reasons for that, right? Like COVID is going crazy. It's sort of thrown everybody's lives up in the air. There's a giant sort of economic crisis associated with that. The US-China relationship seems to be getting worse by the day. We're having the worst racial conflagration since the late 60s. There's a bitter partisan fight over an open SCOTUS seat. Like 2020 feels something like a dumpster fire, which is fair enough. So like people are really just kind of like, oh my God, how much worse can it get? And that's kind of the feeling. But beyond just thinking that things are not great, it's important to recognize the importance of kind of the nexus point that we're at. We really are at an important sort of fork in the road for the way global politics looks. And if you want to understand that, it's important to kind of go back to like the end of World War II. It's almost impossible to overstate just how horrifying that war was. 40 million people are left dead. Europe is almost completely decimated. There was just a huge amount of human suffering. There's also the Holocaust is part of that. And at least in my opinion, and I think many others' opinion, it really is like the darkest hour in human history. You have Hiroshima and Nagasaki sort of wiped off the map by nuclear weapons. World War II was truly cataclysmic in a way no other conflicts have been. So arising out of that, we had a whole bunch of institutions to get built. The most famous is the United Nations, but it's certainly not the only one. You also get the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, sort of part of the Bretton Woods organizations that are going to try to tamper down some of the economic tensions that made the Great Depression worse and were seen to give rise to fascism. Part of this was also sort of building the GATT, what would later become the World Trade Organization. It was believed then, and it's still widely believed now, that tying countries together via trade would promote peace and wealth and prosperity. So you get a lot more global growth in trade over time that creates a lot more general wealth, right? Like you can look at sort of study after study showing that these two are linked quite strongly. Not only does it promote wealth, but the EU, before it is anything else, is a trade bloc, right? Before the EU becomes this sort of larger political entity, it's a coal and steel community. Using commerce to tie countries together is part of the meta project of Western politics for the couple of decades after World War II. Again, not only do you get this sort of greater building of wealth, but better prosperity for ordinary people. People get refrigerators and they get automobiles. And this is not just a US thing. This also takes part in Western Europe, in Japan, in Australia, New Zealand. Parts of the developing world are starting to get more public health and more public prosperity. So there's a lot of improving in the situation that's going on. There's a lot of diplomacy underlinking that. There's a lot of better attitudes towards foreigners, less xenophobia, less nationalism, right? And so you've got this sort of broader sense that countries are going to work together. They're not going to see each other in these starkly zero-sum terms all the time, right? You're going to get things like the Olympics. So it's not just purely political stuff. It's a broader sort of philosophical worldview moment that countries are going to work together in a spirit of cooperation, not just to make sure World War II doesn't happen, but to try to build a better world. It's very much what like NATO is also part of, is like pulling together this like Western alliance and this international liberal order. NATO is obviously super important, starting with like the Berlin airlift to make sure that the Soviet Union can't take over West Berlin, right? They drop tons of supplies into that city to sort of maintain that bastion of freedom amidst the Soviet bloc, right? For decades, NATO continues to do stuff like that. I mean, even all the way up through 9/11. 9/11 was a horrible tragedy for the United States, and all of our NATO allies were there for us the next day. Whatever we needed to do, they were going to be with us. So NATO is also part of the security backdrop to that. Every president from FDR to Obama supports this, including Republicans. You get FDR, you get Truman, you get Eisenhower, a Republican, you get JFK, you get Johnson, Nixon, another Republican, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, again, two more Republicans, Clinton, George W. Bush. This was a project that both political parties supported, right, including Republicans. So Trump's breakaway from this is not just a breakaway from Obama. It's a breakaway from the Republicans that supported this order and preceded him. So you get Obama, right, and then you get President Trump, and he's sort of lashing out against this. And I don't put this like yelly picture just to like be funny. I do it because he is in stark contrast in terms of how he thinks about that global order compared to all of those presidents before him. This global order created a ton of benefits. For one, it made a lot of people really look up to America. Sometimes we can forget this now, but for many, many years, for decades even, across the world, people thought of America as like the place where dreams came true, the place where you could be who you wanted to be, and on the strength of your own merit could sort of rise in the world. Fareed Zakaria has talked about this, but many, many others who have grown up abroad and then immigrated to the United States have talked about this sort of city on a hill imagery that the United States had. So that's one of the great benefits of American leadership of that international liberal order. It's also created a ton of wealth. The United States is the wealthiest, most prosperous society, as far as a large country that the world has really ever known in terms of a power. It's also created a whole lot of peace, right? Like we had World War I and World War II in a 30-year stretch. We haven't had a World War III. If you had asked somebody in 1946, hey, what do you think about getting to 2020 and not having a World War III? They would have said, that's amazing. That's great. We love the fact that there's not a World War III. So there's been a whole lot of just like mega benefits to this international liberal order that I think sometimes people forget about because they're in the background. But these benefits are almost like electricity. You take them for granted and so you don't notice them until you don't have them. And then all of a sudden that electricity or that liberal order starts looking really, really good. And then comes Donald Trump, right? This is sort of a cover page from Der Spiegel, a German political magazine, but I think it really captures Trump's attitude towards this liberal order. He sees the world in these very zero-sum, very mercantilist terms, and he's ready to light it on fire. Like, his attitude and the attitude of many of his supporters was burn it all down. We don't like what's going on here. We don't like the multiculturalism. We don't like the globalization. We don't like the cosmopolitan modernity that is a lot of urban America today, right? And so you see this in foreign policy, right? Like, this is a picture from a couple years ago, but it very much like captures the mood that other international leaders have towards Trump and Trump towards them. He's going to oppose these institutions. He's very contemptuous of of institutions. He's sort of cozied up to autocrats. He doesn't like the UN. He's pulled out of the Iran deal. He's pulled out of Paris, right? He's, really not going to be a leader who joins our traditional allies. He's very much been on the side of Duterte and Putin and Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and he's very comfortable with Saudi Arabia. Like, that's his sort of worldview. He's been very opposed to trade. He's been anti-NAFTA. They sort of renamed it the USCA and USMCA, and he sort of tried to take credit for that, even though the USMCA really only changes NAFTA around the margins. But he's been very stridently anti-trade. He pulled the United States out of the TPP. That was sort of one of his first big foreign policy moves, and to sort of extract the United States from this liberal order. He and John Bolton and sort of those other acolytes have really tried to blow apart a lot of the traditional alliances. They've been very hostile to our traditional allies. Really, the only countries they get along with quite consistently are Israel, Poland, and Hungary. Like, that kind of populist nationalist kind of regime is the only kind of country that they consistently get along with. Been very anti-foreigner, right? Like, the treatment of migrants is part of the attempt to be intentionally nasty towards immigrants, to try to keep them away, to try to be sort of stridently anti-immigrant in ways that are new and different. Reagan was not like this. Reagan wanted an amnesty. George H.W. Bush was very pro-immigrant. He wanted a kinder, gentler America. So again, Trump is not just anti-Obama. He's anti that consensus that lasted for about 75 years. He's been consistently anti-China on all kinds of matters. He's even gone so far as to engage in quite frankly, racist rhetoric, calling the coronavirus the China virus or the Wuhan virus. He has this like fortress mentality, and that's how he sees the world in these very different ways from his predecessors. Again, Republicans don't, like, traditional Republicans would not consider Trump to be in their camp. Whatever you think about Reagan's policies, he was a good person. George H.W. Bush was a brilliant mind. Compared to George H.W. Bush, Trump is an intellectual pygmy. They would not respect him. I'm 33, so my lifetime goes back to the Reagan administration. You can make a good case that in that lifetime, the best foreign policy president has been George H.W. Bush. So, he managed the end of the Cold War. We dealt with Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. There's just a lot of good things that H.W. Bush did on the global arena. So I don't want to paint this as like an anti-traditional Republican thing, but I do want to emphasize over and over again how much Trump is a departure from that tradition. We've really seen a lot of our, traditional allies and those relationships, those bridges are burning. They are on fire as we speak. Like, when we think about what hangs in the balance in this election, we have those relationships on fire. We have the U.S. and China increasingly in a hostile relationship. COVID is sort of being dealt with poorly by both of them at the same time, while they use it as leverage against each other. A lot of countries that are in the middle, particularly in Southeast Asia, feel like they're stuck between two different really aggressive powers. You've got global inequality getting worse. Climate change continues unabated with little done. And again, the Trump administration pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So are we going to double down on having one crisis after the next, almost like it's sort of Oprah giving out all these crises like they're cars? Or are we going to not do that? In a lot of ways, the Biden administration represents kind of a fire extinguisher. Nobody's ever been emotionally moved by a fire extinguisher. It's not, it's not a thing people get inspired by, but when you need a fire extinguisher, you're glad it's there. And that's very much how I sort of see a Biden administration. It's just putting out some of these fires, maybe not building a new world order, but just getting things under control. And so that's the choice before us with this election. Are we going to pick the fire extinguisher, or are we going to throw more gasoline on all the fires? And so a Biden administration is probably going to try to rebuild some of those burned bridges, probably going to try to tamp down on that trade war between the United States and China. This trade war has actually been very bad for a lot of farmers in the Midwest. It's been bad for auto companies that use steel and aluminum. It's been bad for consumers. It's really hurt the United States quite badly. And so there's a lot of reasons why the Biden administration, even if it doesn't want to like build a new TPP or push trade forward in big positive ways, will probably tamp down on some of these pretty counterproductive trade war policies. They'll likely be a lot more pro-immigrant. I think I can say that with quite a bit of certainty, and probably get us back into Paris very quickly. And this is in line with broader public sentiment. One of the things that Donald Trump has actually done is he's made both trade and immigration more popular by being his sort of Trumpy self. He's actually pushed a lot of people against his worldview and towards really reappreciating that international liberal order. At the same time, that international liberal order is not just under threat from the Trump administration, it's also under threat from a rising and deeply illiberal China. It's striking and stark how authoritarian dictatorship China is. You do not have freedom of speech. You do not have freedom of press. You do not have freedom of religion. There's social monitoring everywhere. It really is starting to feel like a panopticon. You have facial recognition and social credit monitoring systems that are keeping a lid on any form of dissent. This is one of the most iconic images of the last 40 years anywhere. And the information control system in China are such that when BBC reporters asked Chinese people if they'd ever seen this, ever seen the Tiananmen Square photograph, they have no clue. This isn't sort of a caption I put in. This is footage from interviews. There are a bunch of these, right? Like this is one of the most powerful photographs of the last 30, 40 years, and most Chinese people had never, ever seen it. That's the kind of control system we're talking about. Hong Kong is being repressed brutally. It's losing virtually all of its freedoms in a very rapid and very harsh manner. There are giant concentration camps holding up to maybe 1 million Uyghurs. It's been quite accurately called a cultural genocide. They're re-education camps of sort of the worst form you can imagine. China's bullying everybody else in the region. The rest of the region is afraid of them and doesn't like them. It's emboldening authoritarians elsewhere, like Robert Mugabe, and like the military junta in Myanmar. The U.S.-China relationship is going to be this really important thing that determines not just if that international liberal order holds, but how a lot of other things get managed. Now, on the positive side, there are some areas where they have mutual interest. Both China and the United States have an interest in clamping down on climate change. They both have an interest in having sort of a recovery from COVID and an economic recovery around that. They both have an interest in making sure North Korea doesn't do anything too crazy. So there are reasons there are some glimmers of hope that the U.S.-China relationship is not automatically and inescapably zero-sum. At the same time, China is not the monolith that can sometimes be portrayed as. There are deep inequalities, which are going to sort of continue to corrode at the legitimacy of the regime. The demographic situation is going to get ugly in about a decade. The one-child policy, was not only sort of a giant, giant repression of a core human right, which is have the children that you want. It also means that right around 2030, they're going to start having a rapidly aging cohort that is not replaced by workers. And so the demographics in China look very, very bad for productivity and for economic growth starting around 2030. They also have massive environmental problems. The air should not look like this. And it frequently does in some of China's major cities. They're unpopular globally. You can look at public opinion polls around the globe, and China's not popular. Its model of governance is not one most countries want to pick up. The tech space is going to tell us a lot here in this U.S.-China relationship. So it's important to pay attention to the sort of TikTok and Huawei kind of situations. What's the best analogy for the U.S.-China relationship? Well, it's really not the U.S.-UK, as sort of the UK being like the hegemon and the U.S. like being a rising power, because the UK, the British Empire was really comfortable with the U.S. as a rising power in a way that the United States is not comfortable with the rise of China. The Cold War is also not a good analogy either, because the Soviet Union and the United States were really kind of like two hermetically sealed camps in the international community. There are tons and tons of interconnections between the US and China. So the Cold War analogy doesn't really work. I actually think one of the better analogies is Europe pre-World War I, which is on the one hand extremely scary. On the other hand, it's not hard to play back some hypotheticals in your head of World War I just not happening if people had been a little smarter. And so I think we are in a dangerous moment, but we're also in a moment that's not completely inescapably terrible. We can get out of this, but part of that is requires being committed to this liberal order in a way that the Trump administration doesn't. So we're really at this crossroads moment. Is America gonna continue to turn towards nationalism, or is it going to re-embrace that leadership role and be sort of the linchpin of that international liberal order? And here's where you come in. Like, you got to vote. Like, 2020 is an election. If these are things you care about, if this is a thing that matters to you, like go vote. Like, we talked about the dumpster fire at the beginning of this. If the dumpster is on fire and you want the fire put out, like, voting's how you do that. So take it from the most famous Vermonter there is, who everyone around here loves, which is you need to go vote. I know that was a whole lot of stuff. I know that was a lot of stuff to throw at you. I tried to get it in pretty quick because I wanted to save time for Q&A. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to field any questions if people want to raise their hand.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Winslett. So if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to turn off your camera, raise your hand, and Professor Winslett will call on students.
Oh, if we could use the raise hand function in the participants, that'll just be a little easier.
Sure.
Okay, Jerry, if you want to, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. Yeah, you're already on. What's up?
So, I actually just came from the Association of Chinese Politics, so that discussion is definitely very relevant. I actually just had a talk with Urza Vogel. But is it possible for me to not have a question, but like a bit of commentary as well?
Please.
Yeah. So in regard to all the point that you made, I think what I view Trump was essentially that he was the fruit of the liberal order. He was a reactionary response to a lot of problems that we must face in establishing that liberal order, which was that from the very beginning, from the 80s, when we have the Washington Consensus, the United States was pretty much still a large major industrial power at that time. But throughout the 80s, 90s, the thousands, you have a lot of outsourcing going on, and that definitely create a lot of popular unrest.
Well, so just to correct something a little bit there, so the best estimate we have is that 87% of manufacturing job losses weren't outsourcing, it was automation. You actually have manufacturing, you actually have more manufacturing today than you've ever had before. You had more in 2016 than you'd ever had prior to that. What you've seen go down is manufacturing employment. And so there is a little bit of a difference there.
And real wage, according to what I learned in macro, there was a stagnation in real wage increase for the last 40 years. So that was some kind of reactionary response to that issue that was going on in the liberal order. And also, this kind of outsourcing and international capitalism featuring outsourcing to another country, because naturally there's lower wage, less regulation outside. That means that there's essentially some kind of international hierarchy being setting up with the most.
You're really overestimating the importance of outsourcing. I really don't think it's as much of a story as much a part of the story in the stagnant wages as you're making it out.
Okay, then I would actually just briefly talk about the issue with China. I think from a lot of, not a consensus, but the study of the so-called Chinese model, there wasn't really a motivation or you haven't seen a large exportation of the so-called Chinese model in other countries. So I do agree with you that it's not an ideological war. It's not something that you see in Soviet Union, which is actively copying the Soviet Stalinist model in Eastern Europe countries. China is not necessarily doing that.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
It's not doing that, but it's exporting a lot of technology that is capable of doing so. It's exporting its civilians policy and civilian capability to a lot of these developing authoritarian state in Africa. But you definitely don't see that exportation of communism or anything as extreme as in the case of Soviet Union. So that we can probably say that we're not going to have the Cold War again.
Yeah,
and in the case of internally, I think that high degree of fusion between state and party is definitely one of the things that we must admit when we are studying Chinese politics. So, according to one of the research that I watched today.
What's your question?
It's not a question. It's just a commentary.
I mean, I think other people may want to ask questions. So, I mean, it's
Stop.
but like I think there may be other people in line if that's okay.
Yeah. Just lastly, I think there was a tendency for their regime to fuse patriotism and nationalism, which was definitely alarming.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Jerry. Anybody else have a question they want to ask? Yeah, Isla. Let me find you here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi. I'm wondering. So, you touched on just this kind of very post-World War II context of like cooperation and this process of trying to like build a better world through the international liberal order. And that seems like a fairly like social political process. And I guess this is a pretty general question that I think you probably have heard a lot, but I'm wondering, let's say in November, Biden wins the election. What is the process for like undoing the harm that's been done in more of like a social relational sense with other countries? And would you say that process like takes time, or like will just, Trump losing the election kind of be like a switch flip?
No, well, so it's definitely a process. One thing that I will say that is hopeful is like this is not the first time that there's been a significant upswell of anti-American sentiment. There's a lot of anti-Americanism coming out of Vietnam. When I was a senior in high school, it was 2008. I'm not in high school, senior in college. It was 2008, and we were coming out of the war in Iraq. Now, it helped that the person coming in office was Barack Obama, who was sort of beloved internationally. I think people internationally respect Joe Biden, but I don't think it's the same sort of almost like rock star imagery that Obama has.
Yeah.
So I do think it'll take time, but I don't think it's impossible. I think that the rest of the world is coming to grips conceptually with a kind of schizophrenic America, with sort of America having these like very different instincts within itself. And so I just think that creates some trepidation, but I think it's not like a totally can't come back from it. The order is totally broken kind of situation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Kat?
Yeah. My question actually.
Oh, you're muted.
I thought I had on mute. Okay. My question actually flows pretty well into that. In that, so say, Joe Biden gets elected, fingers crossed, but, and then we rejoin all of these institutions.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be some things that like in that, period of regrowing American, like trust in America, some things are going to be lost. Like I'm thinking particularly about like the WHO right now, and their budget situation. But also that your point that you just made about like the world is coming to grips with a schizophrenic America. Do we think that, the reimagining of the world order when the US eventually does start to return to these roles, it's not going to look the same as it did before. So what is that rebalancing going to look like, and what particular countries do you see playing the biggest role in that?
So this is one of those areas where, again, I think the pre-World War analogy from Europe is actually really helpful because it's a multipolar world. It's not, I think sometimes everybody wants to, like, now that the US and China are the two big players, want to act like it's a bipolar order. It really isn't. It's a multipolar order. India is rising and long-term probably has better growth prospects than China because of the demographics, because of democracy. By 2050, there's going to be 4 times as many people in sub-Saharan Africa as there are in Europe. So that's going to be another pole, albeit less prosperous, but I think it's just a multipolar system. So I think that's the starting point, is just sort of recognize that.
But I guess if I can just follow up, like, if we're heading towards a more multipolar world, like, most of these institutions, I mean, some of them were built during the Cold War and that way, but a lot of them have adapted to this much more unipolar reality. So, like, what does that mean for those institutions, a multipolar order?
I mean, I think some of them will adapt just fine. I think that there will be sort of a recognition that you can't just assume the United States will be a central supportive player in all of them. So right now, the WTO dispute settlement system is completely broken because the United States won't allow any new judges on it. I think if a Biden administration comes in, you'll see those judge roles filled, and you'll see some new institutional mechanisms created that don't allow one country to completely break the system. And so I think there's going to be a lot of that going on, where the Biden administration will end up accepting limits to American power that Republicans will be extremely hostile to. I think there's going to be a lot of Tom Cotton, Josh Hawley yelling nationalism from the side. David?
Yeah, I guess just going back to the election itself, because, sorry, I came in a bit late, so I probably didn't really hear what you were saying, but I was just wondering, like, how do you foresee really the outcome of this election based on what we have? Because I'm just curious, because, like, back to 2016, I think, like, right before the election, I think lots of media has been portraying that, like, Hillary Clinton had a very, like, more than 90% of the probability of winning, but, like, turned out she was losing. So how do you see, like, how this factor will play out in this election? And that's my first question. Also, second question is that I think, how do you see, like, Donald Trump's policy against China will be different from that of Joe Biden? Because I think they were pretty, like, they're pretty, I think they're, like, one of the few agreements they do have is the sort of, like, the policy against China, because I think that they're all trying to act pretty tough on this issue. But yeah, that's my two.
So I think that's a great question. I think those are two great questions. The first one is to say that first of all have an enormous respect for people like Nate Silver and the difficulty of the task. It's really, really difficult to, like, figure out in a poll exactly who your likely voters are, who's going to show up, who doesn't, particularly in a pandemic. And then modeling that is also super, super difficult. So I think the people who do these kinds of things are really smart and trying really hard. That being said, having an election in a pandemic is unprecedented. So any model, any poll should just be read with some humility this year, read with some grains of salt. This is why I didn't start this talk with here's what the Biden administration will do. Like, I presented it as a choice because, like, the choice really is before us. And if you learned anything from 2016, it's like, don't, assume you know the winner of the election because the model on 538 says 72% Clinton or 88% Biden or whatever. So just, like, I think we all should just, like, have some humility here on that. The second question is, and I think this is a fascinating question, how Biden and Trump would be different vis-a-vis China. So at one base level, you're exactly correct that this is one of the areas where there is some bipartisan consensus, that both parties have strident criticisms of China. I do think they're a little bit different in what they emphasize in that. The Trump administration seems to care not a whit for what's going on to the Uyghurs. They seem broadly uninterested in what's going on in Hong Kong. You'll get some people like Tom Cotton make speeches, but the Trump administration hasn't really done anything to, like, give asylum to everybody who lives in Hong Kong. Like you could say to Hong Kong, anybody who can get out and get to the United States gets asylum, and they haven't had that policy. For the Trump administration, it's been a lot of just very mercantilist economics, whereas the Biden administration, I think, would emphasize the Uyghur issue in Hong Kong a lot more. So where the criticism goes, I think, would differ between the two quite substantially in terms of that. I mean, I don't think the Biden administration would, want to create like a new big trade agreement with China or something, but I do think they would tamp down some of the trade war stuff that I think most political economists would tell you it's actually been quite bad for Americans. So I think this is a really great question and sort of gets at the heart of how things may be different or the same over the next couple of years. Thank you. I think we got Olivia and then Porter.
I think Catherine may have been waiting for a little bit also.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Catherine. Sorry about that. And thank you for being so polite.
So this kind of ties into what David was saying with how you mentioned that if Biden were elected, that he might try to rebuild the bridges in terms of like trade agreements with China. I was just wondering how he could do that while also putting pressure on China with their human rights abuses.
Yeah, so I actually think that it's sort of important not to strictly link these super hard. Sanctions have a very mixed record in sort of the history of their use. There's a lot of reasons why sanctions often do not work. And so trying to use the broader trade regime as this like sanctioning mechanism vis-a-vis the Uyghurs and Hong Kong is destructive of the broader relationship and of sort of global prosperity and economic recovery, while probably not actually doing enough to all of a sudden make China behave differently. That being said, I think there are some diplomatic channels, some maneuvers that you could do that the Biden administration may be more interested in doing vis-a-vis those two issues. Like I said, I mentioned sort of asylum for people in Hong Kong. I definitely think you could see more robust asylum policies for Chinese Uyghurs. Given what's going on to them, I think you can make a real case for any Uyghur that can get out of China and to the United States being given temporary protective status. China would seriously not like that, but it would be that would be a policy that wouldn't have these sort of blowback effects on soybean farmers in Iowa or lobster fishermen in Maine. So I would see it probably going in that kind of direction.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess now we'll go to Olivia unless there's somebody else.
Sure. My question is actually sort of connected. I was going to ask what you think both this election and then like the sort of global shift towards a multipolar order might bring in terms of a global human rights regime.
We've definitely, I mean, this has been one of the really heartbreaking things about the last 3 or 4 years is there's definitely been like steps backwards taken on human rights. What happened to the Rohingya in 2017 in Myanmar was just absolutely soul crushing. And nobody did anything. Not the EU, not the United States, not India next door, certainly not China. This has been probably the darkest part of the story the last couple of years is just the walking back of that. And my hope is that a Biden administration would sort of bring the United States back into its sort of former role on human rights, which I don't want to ignore the fact that the United States has a less than pristine record on this. During the Reagan administration, we supported all kinds of Latin American dictators who did all kinds of stuff. We're not perfect on this, but at least in principle, at least in stated values, the United States was pro-human rights, and I'm hoping a Biden administration could get us kind of back to that. Okay, looks like we got a couple minutes left, and then we'll get to Porter's question, and then I think close out. Yeah, Porter, what's up?
Thank you, Professor Winslett. That was fantastic, and thank you to everyone else who asked a lot of the questions I wanted to be answered. So the one I did have was thinking about the long-term view of where America stands. If you, as you said, maybe China is, a big threat now. Maybe it starts to come down a little bit in 10, 15 years or so. In terms of political messaging, where should America stand in terms of taking a stand against certainly totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and sort of maybe a populism, nationalism, hopefully after Trump, or if it's India that's rising as the power that's similarly aligned politically, how is America's position supposed to be, and sort of how do we continue to sort of build ourselves up as that city on the hill?
Mm-hmm. I think this is a great question. This is one of those areas where I think differentiating between the people and the state are really important. I think it's really important to be stridently opposed to the authoritarianism of the Chinese government without being xenophobic, without being anti-Chinese people, without, calling it the China virus and other like really racist stuff. So I think making that clear distinction is sort of a first step. I think I think that one of the things that actually gives me a lot of hope is that if you look at the different generational cohorts, millennials, which I'm a part of, and then Gen Z are very cosmopolitan compared to their elders. They're really embracing of and celebrating of diversity, and of sort of recognition that things like climate change and human trafficking and COVID and a lot of our worst problems they cross borders. And so my hope is that there's actually a certain sea change in terms of mentality around some of these issues. I had the 2 graphs on trade and immigration. I think are showing that maybe there is a kind of reverse wave against this populist nationalism. And my real hope is actually not about the Democrats. It's that Republicans will lose so badly this term that they come back to sanity. I usually don't give away the way that I vote, but I'm going to vote for Phil Scott. I voted for Republicans in the past, not for president, but for some other offices. I'd love to see a Republican Party like return to a Larry Hogan, a Charlie Baker kind of place. I would love to see the 2012 like duo of Obama and Romney be like the argument we're constantly having. And so that's actually my hope is I have a lot of hope in like the liberal tendencies and cosmopolitan is of millennials and Gen Z, but I'm really just hoping that Republicans like decide that like the last 4 years don't count and they're just gonna like shake the Etch a Sketch and start over. But it's a great question. Thank you. And thank you for everybody for coming. This was a lot of fun. I enjoyed doing it. Isabella, did you have anything you wanted to wrap up with?
Just thank you everyone for coming, and keep an eye out for other Hot Topics events coming later in the semester and events from the Roten Center. We're going to have a screening of a documentary about Peruvian potato farmers, so keep an eye out for that. It's really cool. And thank you again so much for hosting, Professor Winslett.
Thank you so much.
Have a good one, everyone.